One of the problems is that the profession doesn't have, and most people don't have, a working definition of language. And so when people say, oh, I learned this way, they think they did, but they really didn't, because what's in their head is not what was on the textbook page.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. I'm Dan Gable, Technology Manager for the LRC. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
LRC Director Angelika Kraemer is joined by Bill VanPatten, host of the popular SLA radio show Tea with BVP. They discuss two perennial issues in language teaching: the roles of input and output, and the role of explicit teaching. Bill also offers some advice for new and seasoned language teachers.
Welcome, everybody, to our second episode of the Cornell LRC podcast, Speaking of Language. Today, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome a very special guest and dear friend of mine. We need drum roll. I guess we'll do this. Bill VanPatten. Hi, Bill.
Hey, Angelika, how you doing?
I am doing great. How are you?
I'm actually doing pretty good, considering.
Oh boy. Well, pretty good is I guess that's what we can strive for, right? We'll take that.
Yep.
So I know you have been very busy over the summer working on new projects and soon launching a new podcast, and I'd like to talk to you about that. But before we get into those details, I have a super broad question for you. As one of the biggest experts on second language acquisition in the nation, in the world, in the universe, what's happening in the land of language learning and teaching these days?
You forgot to add in multiverse. There's more than one universe.
Yeah, absolutely.
My ego ain't that big, let me tell you. All right. So what's happening in language teaching? Well, it's interesting because the way I look at language teaching is part of a continuum, Angelika. And to me, there are perennial questions and perennial issues that keep circling around like bell-bottom pants from the 1970s. They just keep coming around and coming around. And every time I go to language conferences, or for example, this summer I gave a keynote somewhere and these issues came up. I was on not a blog site, what do you call it? It was a Facebook site with some people who are involved in teaching. And these issues came up. They just keep coming up. So I'm going to talk about these perennial issues real quickly.
Awesome, yeah.
There are two of them. One is the relative roles of input and output in language learning and language teaching, and the other is the role of explicit teaching in language teaching. Those things just never seem to go away. So no matter whether you're talking about project-based learning, or you're talking about service learning, or you're talking about proficiency-based this, or communicative language teaching more generally, you're talking about TPRS, doesn't make a difference. These issues always come up. And so I think people have acknowledged more generally the fundamental role of input in language acquisition, language teaching.
Yeah.
They still, as a whole in the language teaching profession, haven't quite grasped what that means and how to deal with it in the classroom. Even though people give it lip service, there's still a lot of language teaching out there that hasn't really moved in the direction of maximizing input in the classroom and interaction with that input in the classroom. So I think the confusion comes from things they hear from different sources about what the role of output is. And there's still a lot of people who think that somehow by making learners talk and making learners practice, that somehow causes language acquisition. And, I know I have a few people out there who will disagree with me, but most scholars would agree with me that that's actually not how language acquisition happens.
Yeah.
So language teaching, what's going on out there right now is people are grappling with this idea of what really is that role of output? What really is that role of practice, so to speak? And even though if we survey teachers, we know a lot of that's going on, both theory and research suggests that it shouldn't be going on that much. There should be other things we should be doing. And then the other side of that coin of what's going on in language teaching is the perennial problem of explicit teaching. And by that, I mean explicitly presenting vocabulary in lists and making learners practice it, explicitly presenting grammar points and so on and making learners practice that. Most language teaching materials, no matter what people claim they are, communicative, proficiency-based, whatever, I should say commercial language materials, still have this idea of you present vocabulary, practice it, you present grammar, you practice it. And that is explicit teaching. And so I think people are by their own experience, think that somehow this does something because they're not seeing a bigger picture beyond what happens in their classrooms. And I also think that there are some forces within the language teaching profession that promote explicit teaching without much research to back it up. And if you want to ask me some follow-up questions, that I'd be happy to share my opinions on that. But those are the major issues that I think are still, no matter what's going on in language teaching, again, project-based, proficiency-based teaching, whether you have task-based teaching, whether you have TPR, whether you have all these different things that are going out there in terms of different kinds of approaches and methods you can take. These issues of the relative roles of input and output and the relative role of explicit teaching always come up and drive people crazy and make people argue even within their own circle of approaches or methods. So that's kind of where we are in language teaching.
Yeah. Well, and I think with especially with regard to explicit teaching, it's probably a lot has to do with it how the current language teachers were taught themselves, right? I mean, this is for many people how they experienced their own second, third, however many language learning experience, and they're kind of defaulting back to how they were taught.
Right. I mean, that's a large part of it. You hit the nail on the head. And the other part of it that kind of underlies that is, again, the profession as a whole. I've said this on my own show in the past and talk about it in my book while we're on the topic that was published by ACTFL this last year. Mm-hmm. That underlying these issues is, again, the profession's inability to grasp what the nature of language. Most people do not have an understanding of what language is, how it exists in the head, and how language is fundamentally different from communication, how that people confuse the two. So one of the problems is that the profession doesn't have, and most people don't have, a working definition of language. Yeah. And so when people say, "Oh, I learned this way," they think they did, but they really didn't, because what's in their head is not what was on the textbook page. Yeah. And so those of us who are actual linguists, who actually think about language and the theory of language and so on, try to point this out, and it's difficult for people to understand. And I think that is one of the major underlying problems. Until the profession comes to grips with the nature of language and actually defines it and says, this is what we mean by language, and this is how language is different from communication, then we're not going to move forward on solving some of those issues or answering our questions about explicit, implicit teaching and input and output and so on.
Yeah. So do you have some suggestions for our listeners on where they can get additional information, where they can get started if they're interested in learning more about what is the role of input and, what is the role or not of explicit teaching, and what are the alternatives? Where can they get started?
Well, I already put a plug in for my book, so I'll put it in again because it's a starting point. It's not an end point. Again, It's a starting point. It's a book I did with ACTFL last year, 2017. It's a year old now. I just realized August of 2017, September. It's called While We're on the Topic, and you can purchase it both in hard copy and in a reduced cost if you're an ACTFL member, in an e-version. So it's actually not that expensive. And it's a short book meant to be very readable. And the whole idea about that book is not to be the end all be all, but to plant all these questions in a very reader friendly way with additional readings and so on, so that you can go explore some more if you want to afterwards. So I would recommend people start there. There's not a lot of books, to be honest with you, not a lot of writings out there. How do I say this without sounding like the person you made me out to be at the beginning, the king of the universe or whatever it is, the multiverse. But there's not a lot of people out there like me who try to constantly bridge this gap between theory and research and the classroom.
Well, but that's so important.
And linguistics in the language classroom. Yeah. Communication is in the language classroom. There's not a lot of us who do that. There's maybe 4 or 5 of us actually in the United States. And so I always tell people, start with my stuff and I point you in the direction of where to go after that. So that you don't just take my word for it, but then I give you other readings to go for it. I consider myself to be that first step in a long journey, but not the journey itself.
Yeah, a facilitator. I like that. Yeah. And I do want to echo. I mean, I've read the book. I own the hard copy and the e-version. And I do have to say, it's a really nice, compact resource that's so accessible. And I've actually held workshops throughout the country focusing on some of the chapters that you've written. And every teacher that I spoke with so far, they really enjoyed how you consolidated the information and how it was easy to process. And they had good ideas for how they can adapt and change their own teaching. So that's wonderful.
I like to hear that. Thank you for saying that. And later on, when you ask me about the show, I can put a plug in for that. That's another place, a resource site for people. And I always give people other ideas to.
Yeah. Well, so why don't you tell us about this new show? What's going on there?
Well, as you know, Angelika, because you were part of the team, we had Tea with BVP that ran out of Michigan State University for 3 years. And then I left in the spring of 2018. And so the show discontinued back in, I think it was February, end of January, beginning of February. And I knew that I was going to do another show, but it would be independent because I am now an independent scholar. I'm not affiliated with any university. And so we are starting a new show on September the 12th. It's going to debut on that Wednesday, September 12th at 3 p.m. California time, which is 6 o'clock East Coast time. So we are maximizing our exposure to the lower 48 states. Sorry, Hawaii. Sorry, Alaska. But we couldn't squeeze you in for a variety of reasons. So it's a live show. You can call in and talk to us. And the name of the show is Talkin L2 with BVP. And the idea is it's going to be similar to Tea with BVP, that people can call in and ask questions, make comments about things, both about language acquisition and language teaching, both theoretical and pragmatic and practical and so on. We cover all range of topics. And I'm pleased to say to the audience listening right now that my good friend Angelika Kraemer is going to be one of my co-hosts again.
Yay!
The miracle of technology. We're going to be doing this. And there's actually 4 different sites involved. And Walter Hopkins, our co-host from Tea with BVP, will be back. And so he'll be in a site, the actual studio where the computer system is that's doing everything, and the phone answering stuff is going to happen in Phoenix.
Wow.
I'm in California, so the technology, we'll see how it all works out. We're going to do some test runs this week, and then we launch on the 12th. So I'm pretty hopeful that everything's going to work out pretty well.
That is
so
exciting.
Again, it's going to not be quite like Tea with BVP, but it is enough that our listeners who were involved before, were our fans, listen religiously, are going to like what we do. And then new people who are new to these kinds of podcasts can chime in. And I'll just tell people real quick, that's an hour show.
Okay.
You can listen to it live through Mixler. It's going to be mixler.com/talkinl2. That's it. And all the information is going to be going out starting tomorrow.
Okay.
On websites, will be going out on social media, it'll be going out on emails and so on. So the information will trickle out to people. And you can listen live, or you can listen to it as a podcast afterwards through iTunes or on SoundCloud. So we will make it available as many ways as we can, because we like to maximize who we talk to and who we get to talk to. Because I like people calling in.
Yep, that is awesome. Well, and we will, of course, promote that as well here through the LRC at Cornell, and we will also post the link, so our listeners can have it at their fingertips to listen to this live call-in show as well. Perfect. Well, this is very exciting. So before we sign off here, the new semester just started for us. Do you have any parting wisdom for our new language instructors here at Cornell, our seasoned language instructors? Anything that you can consolidate, something that maybe they should implement in their teaching this semester, something that they should do, or maybe something that they shouldn't do? The wisdom of BVP.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to tell them what to do, what not to do, but I'm going to give them some advice of a more psychological nature. How's that? Emotive psychological nature. For the newbies, for the people who are just getting started, you are going to freak out. It's going to be overwhelming. You're not going to know what you're doing half the time, or you're going to think you don't know what you're doing. And part of what you're going to wind up having to do is going to be constrained by the program you're in. So I don't know anything about Cornell's language programs, but you always are subject to the materials you're given to use and what your supervisors expect out of you, and so on and so forth. Because all language teaching ultimately is local, right? Yep. And so you adapt, give yourself some space, don't freak out, go to your supervisor as much as possible, go to the veterans, Don't be afraid to ask questions. It's okay. You're a new person. That's what you're supposed to do, is learn and ask questions. So remember, you've got a lot to learn, and just think of yourself as, you have students in the classroom, but now you're a student of language teaching. And so you've got to learn from other people. And my advice to the veterans is help the newbies, but don't forget, you veterans are still learning. Don't think just because you're a veteran, you know everything that's to know about language teaching. None of us do. How long have I been doing this, Angelika? You know my joke. I always say that I'm a year away from Depends, right? I'm a year away from Depends, and I'm practically taking Geritol now. So, and I'm learning new things. I think about stuff. I go to workshops and conferences. I go, hey, I hadn't thought about that way. I wonder if I can incorporate, and I'm always thinking about that kind of stuff. So it doesn't make any difference who you are, what expertise you have, what expertise you don't have, how long you've been doing it. You could always learn stuff. So veterans, remember that just because you're veterans doesn't mean you stop learning. It means, and don't forget, the new people might have some good ideas too. You just never know. So everybody's got to talk to each other. That's my big advice to people, is create a community of teachers among yourselves and talk to each other. Do not be typical academics that don't talk to each other. Be language teachers that talk.
Exactly.
That's my advice, psychologically.
Yeah, no, and that is perfect and valuable advice. And that's actually gives me a good point of reference to remind all of our listeners who are local here to Cornell that we have our speaker series. All that information is on our website. So I do invite all of you, whether you're new to teaching or you are experienced, make sure to come to these events. Or if you can't make it in person, all of those talks are archived. So check out our website. And just keep learning. Awesome.
Just like Ellen DeGeneres said this, just keep learning.
Swimming,
keep learning.
Absolutely.
Just keep learning.
Cool. Well, hey, Bill, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure. We are very excited about the launch of your new podcast. So again, that's September 12th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Talkin L2 with BVP. More information is forthcoming on our website and our social media as well. And to all our listeners, good luck for the semester. And again, thank you, Bill.
Well, thank you, and good luck on your new job. Everybody who's doesn't know Angelika there at Cornell, you got a great person. So take care of her for me. And stuff that she does is golden. So when she gets her hands on things, it's going to you're going to have some great stuff going on at Cornell. So good luck. And Sam back there in the booth, thank you so much for the podcast. Sam, it was a pleasure to meet you. And I will say goodbye and talk to everybody hopefully on the 12th of September.
There we go. Sounds like a plan. Awesome. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu or look for Cornell LRC on Facebook and Twitter. Speaking of Language is produced by Sam Lupowitz and Dan Gable. Recorded by Sam Lupowitz. Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University. As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University. We thank our listeners and do stay tuned for our next episode.